Next from Springfield, we talked to Representative Will Davis about Senate Bill 100, which establishes guidelines for school discipline. This runs about 20 minutes.
Representative Will Davis, thanks for joining us again on the Untitled Chapter. One of the pieces of legislation that passed a year ago, Senate Bill 100, had to do with discipline. I'm going to have you tell us more about it, but what was the purpose of the bill? And then let's do a follow-up. Do we know of any of the implications thus far now that it's been enacted for a year?
Well, Senate Bill 100 was an initiative that I sponsored in the House and Senator Kim sponsored in the Senate, and is essentially an examination of the use of exclusionary disciplinary in schools, i.e. suspensions and expulsions. Some of the data show that there was an overuse of exclusionary discipline in schools, particularly aimed at students of color. So this was an effort to kind of come back and say, look, we don't want to impact your ability to discipline students when necessary, but maybe we ought to consider how we go about doing that. Not necessarily a process, but recognize that maybe there are circumstances surrounding why students are acting out, and said instead of just a blanket policy to exclude students out of school, then maybe we would look at every other possible means of disciplinary action before you get to discipline that results in a student being out of school. We weren't trying to limit the power of police, if there needed to be arrests made and things of that nature, but again, you just can't make an assumption why a student is acting out, and this just really encouraged an examination and that you use every possible form of disciplinary before you actually put the student out.
I'm going to make an analogy to see if that helps to illustrate the problem that existed beforehand, and it might be if the only action we had was the death penalty, we might be overreacting to any number of people who committed crimes, but if the only option was the death penalty, we're giving the death penalty out when we wouldn't have had to do that. And what we really needed to do in that instance is have intermediate forms of punishment. Is that a fair way of saying kind of what you were faced with here, where the discipline had to be reestablished in the schools when people act up, but there wasn't that line of gradation of punishment that would go up the ladder, so to speak?
You're essentially correct. The other forms of discipline did exist, but school districts were opting not to use some of the other pathways of discipline and just suggesting, hey, maybe this student is a problem, whether they were or not a continued problem, but this student's a problem. The best way we can do it is just to push them out of the school. Now that means the community had to deal with that individual. The student wasn't learning, they weren't in school, they weren't in an educational environment. So again, use of that type of disciplinary probably caused more problems ultimately than it solved. But again, the idea was to just say, let's take a step back, let's use all of our tools that we may have, all the tools in the toolbox before we get to that point. But in the process, maybe we can identify and discover the reasons why students are doing certain things or acting a certain way. Are there factors in the community that they're dealing with, that they're bringing into school that now may cause them to act out? Are we providing enough social services? Are we providing enough opportunities for them to talk through some of their challenges and concerns? But in the event that a disciplinary action had to be taken, could we use in-school suspensions? At least they're still in the institution. They still have access to work, to teachers, so we can continue their education versus excluding them from the educational setting.
So, first of all, it's good here that there's a discussion on looking at discipline. I think so many times in education we only hear about we need to spend more money, and I've had these conversations with school superintendents that if you don't have discipline in the classroom, you could spend $100,000 a year per pupil and you're not going to learn if you don't have the learning environment in the classroom. And yet at the other time, on the other hand, any number of teachers have complained that sometimes they're not supported as far as trying to discipline kids who are disrupted. So you have to walk that line, don't you? I mean, I think which maybe this bill is trying to get to say we're going to have discipline in the classroom, but on the other hand, you don't want to destroy some young person's future by just expelling them from school and then they never even get a high school degree. What are some of the steps? I mean, as in a simplified fashion, what are some of the gradation of punishment, and is there any results from the field thus far, any feedback they've heard from schools as far as how it's working?
Well, in terms of the steps, I mean, schools have in-school suspensions that they could use. Maybe they could exclude a student from a particular activity or something like that takes place in the school. So again, there are a number of different ways to look at it, but also what this implies is that discipline must be consistent. Sometimes you had teachers exacting different types of discipline for the same offense. And so it really caused the school to really be able to take a step back and look at their internal policies about how they administer discipline. It's led to the use of kind of uniform codes, if you will. We've worked with the Chicago Lawyers Committee on Civil Rights. They have developed consistent guidelines that schools can adopt toward exacting their discipline. One of the misconceptions about this is that it automatically costs a school money. And the reality is that it doesn't automatically cost school any additional resources. Again, it's just requiring you to take a step back and look at how you administer discipline, the policies and procedures that each district or each school has toward administering those policies and procedures. So I think it just kind of blew the cover off the inconsistencies that exist from school to school within a district, as well as from district to district, from the city of Chicago to downstate Illinois and upstate Illinois. Everybody was just doing it a little differently, and this really asked schools to take a step back and really look at, are there ways in which we can exact discipline the same way, regardless of who the student is? Because again, one of the statistical pieces that we found was that the discipline unfortunately impacted students of color more than it did white students. And that was a challenge.
Well, and I think it would behoove even the students to know, if you, like any of us, if I speed, 5 miles an hour over the speed limit, it's not going to be the same as if I'm driving 50 miles an hour over the speed limit, where we at least have some sense as citizens that there's some relationship between what we're doing and the crime that might be, or the punishment that would be applied. And as you say, that was kind of missing, so that the more this is carried out in the future, now that that's being implemented, the students will learn kind of what the guidelines are themselves, I guess, maybe through painful trial and error, but they'll learn. Right?
And certainly students should know kind of what their rights and obligations are as a student in the school. I mean, again, we don't want students to disrupt the environment for other students that are there to learn as well, but also recognize that, sometimes students do act out. And if this is a child's first offense, and to punish them by excluding them out of the school building, again, their first offense, we don't know what we could be setting off or triggering in that student, where they may feel that, wow, I mean, I've tried to be a good student all these years, and yeah, I had one slip up, and the answer to that is that I now get, expelled or suspended from school. What does that mean for that student moving forward? And those are just some of the things you have to take into consideration.
Are there, as I often point out to people, none of us got to pick our parents. Some of us won the parent lottery and some of us didn't. One of the problems that's widely recognized is some of the problems that we have in the classroom is because there's not enough parent engagement in certain families. Does this address that in any way? I'm not sure if it can, but is there ever any implication for the parents relative to the action of the students in the classroom?
Well, I mean, I won't say a direct correlation in that respect, but again, what I think it does is that if you find a student who is acting out, maybe that school district is now, instead of just saying, I need to discipline you, maybe they're actually paying attention to what's going on with the student, where there might be some challenges in the home or in the community that they have to deal with on their way to school. Some school districts use social services. They have social workers and psychologists and psychiatrists that are a part of their faculty and administration in the schools. But again, it's really encouraging them to engage the student as well, and maybe have some dialogue with them and really try to find out what some of the challenges are for the student. I mean, it could be a situation where you have a student in a classroom who is in a regular classroom, but they aren't being challenged enough. they're smart students and maybe they need to be pushed a little more or put into a different set of classes, accelerated or advanced classes, to help, challenge them a little bit more and focus their mind in different ways. But if we're not engaging the student in a way and just simply disciplining them, we never know exactly what may exist or ways in which we might actually be able to help the student become better at being a student.
What kind of reaction have you had from teachers and administrators? Sometimes they feel the legislature's throwing one more mandate at them, one more hoop they got to jump through. Are they welcoming this input? And to what extent did you write up, or was the bill crafted with them in mind?
Well, certainly all constituencies, a lot of advocacy groups sat at the table. This bill took 2 years to craft, so there was a lot of input from the school management associations. There was a lot of input from law enforcement, the state's attorneys, sheriff's departments. A lot of people put a lot of time into crafting this bill, so we tried to take all of those things into consideration to come out ultimately with this final product. And there's a little pushback from schools because I think schools don't like to be pushed into doing something. But again, the way we're couching it is that, again, we're not trying to take discipline away from you. We're just asking you to examine it a little differently. And there have been a number of conversations that are taking place all throughout the state. I've participated in several meetings with school districts. Senator Lightford has done the same. The Chicago Lawyers Committee has traveled across the state. And the good thing about that is that school districts are recognizing that this is indeed coming, and they're trying to do a lot of work on the front end to make sure that they're ready, to make sure that they're prepared to be able to fully implement this in the upcoming school year. So we appreciate all the hard work that districts are putting into this and the conversation that they're putting into this. And what we shared with them is that, there's legislation that sometimes needs to be changed at some point. And we're open to you implement. Maybe there might need to be certain tweaks to it, and we encourage them to bring those tweaks to us so we can, again, put them back into the conversation amongst all the advocacy groups and see how we might be able to help school districts if they have some particular challenges with the implementation of what we call SB 100.
Let me, if I might, since that might be a good thing to follow up, and we'll see as time goes on more, and if any tweaks are necessary, or what kind of feedback you're getting from the schools. Hopefully it's helpful to both the schools and the students. Before we let you go, we're here on what should be the last day of the session. For the second year in a row, it's, as Yogi Berra said, deja vu all over again, and yet this year it's different just because everyone is in such a crisis mode as far as like higher education, social services. We at least the K through 12 got funded, but now we don't know what's going to happen with there. What are your thoughts on just the overall process of or lack of a process of putting together a budget in this standoff that has now gone for 12 months, and we still don't have any resolution to it?
Well, I think for your viewers, at the very least, let's understand that the governor made it very clear from the very beginning is that he was looking for what he called his turnaround agenda, things that we call non-budgetary items. And he said, if I don't get some of these items, then I'm not interested in passing or supporting a budget. So we're still kind of in that mode with our current governor. There have been a number of work groups, small groups of legislators from all four caucuses talking and meeting about some of these things. I think, at least in terms of the budget work group that I'm a participant on, we walked out of there at least with the framework of a budget. And what we didn't hear until fairly recently was how the governor felt about that framework, and the Republican caucuses felt about that framework. I mean, there was a lot of time and effort put into it by several different members. Even the course of this small break that we had from Friday to Sunday, there were still meetings that took place that we all participated in. And there is some uniqueness to this because, again, we've had difficulty with previous governors before, but none of them have ever interrupted the passage of a budget. But our current governor feels that I'm not interested in supporting a budget until. Now, while he suggested that he's willing to come to the table, add revenue, as well as maybe make some spending reductions, I always encourage individuals to go back and take a look at what he introduced. If you really want to know how he felt about your service, whatever you did, go back and look at his introduced budget, because what you'll see there are significant reductions in human and social services. You'll see significant cuts to higher education, only slight increases to K through 12, which we appreciate, but we know there's always a need for more resources in K through 12. What we did see was increases to corrections. So what message is he sending there? You know, is he setting the stage for more people to wind up in our correction system? So I just encourage people to kind of take a step back. Don't necessarily get caught up in the emotion of what's going on right now, but if you are a real steward of this, go back and take a look at where we started. That sets the stage for a lot of things moving forward.
Now that he's been in, I mean, he came in 18 months ago. What's the feeling among the rank and file members? I'm sure there's a lot of frustration, but would you say that the divisions are severe or not as severe relative to the lawmakers themselves?
Well, I think it depends on which day you're talking about. Like, for instance, you know, I thought that in our budget working group that we were working, that we were having decent conversation, you know, really working through some of the overall challenges of what we said. And then I see a memo put out by the budget director who's leading these discussions and talk about the consternation of the majority party not wanting to be an active participant in the process. But I've been at those budget meetings. So why am I now, you know, a part of the problem when I've been looking to try to be part of the solution? So again, I think it just depends on where you are, and that's rather disappointing. I mean, we can agree and disagree on a lot of things, but if I'm coming to the meetings and showing up at those meetings and participating, clearly I want to be a part of fixing and getting to the end of this. And so I think sometimes, you know, as a member, I take a step back. Maybe really this was all for show in the first place. I think the governor made it very clear that turnaround agenda items are exactly what he wanted. And if we give some of those, if we give some room in those turnaround items, and he gets those and he signs them, but then we pass a budget that we think we all have work to craft, if his intent really is less spending, then he's going to have the ability to make reductions in that budget through the tools that he has as a governor, and he will do that knowing that unfortunately there's not a majority of individuals, particularly on the Democratic side, that will be able to come back and override his veto. So he's going to get what he wants in terms of reform items, and he's ultimately going to try to get what he wants in the budget by reducing the level of spend, because once he makes those reductions, unfortunately, we cannot come back and override them.
All right, well, Davis, thank you for joining us on the Illinois Channel.
Our
Good
pleasure.
luck to
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks a lot.